So now that we're on to the third generation of Apple Silicon in MacBooks, it's about time that we rewind a little bit and look back at the first generation M1 series MacBooks. So the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro from late 2020. This right here is my M1 MacBook Pro from 2020. It's got 16 gigs of RAM and a 1 terabyte SSD, and it's aged disturbingly well over these past few years. Now, I will admit my experience has probably been better than others due to my upgraded specs, so the max amount of RAM and the 1 terabyte SSD. But that being said, I know plenty of people that have the base model MacBook Air, so the 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, and they use it for basic tasks, and it has aged like fine wine. The main advantage that Apple had when these MacBooks first came out was their efficiency, their incredible power coupled with their extremely high battery life. And that certainly was the case when I first got my Mac. I could go maybe 10 to 12 hours of mixed usage, so that's like all my schoolwork combined with like a little bit of gaming, and the heaviest of it all being video editing. Now, I got my Mac about a year after it originally came out, and after 2.5 years of usage, those numbers have definitely gone down. I started noticing the battery start to dwindle like about a year ago. That's when, the battery health started to drop. Now I'm getting roughly 7 to 8 hours of mixed usage, and I could go max maybe 2 days without needing to charge it. And that's still not bad. Like 7 to 8 hours is still pretty great for a laptop that's almost 3 years old. I'd put it on par with how much battery life you'd get from a new Intel MacBook Pro if you bought it back then. But that being said, the moment I try to start doing intensive things on this laptop, obviously the battery life is now like 5, maybe 4 hours if I'm doing stuff like video editing or gaming. The other main aspect that Apple capitalized on when these M series chips first came out was their performance.
The world's fastest CPU core, the world's best CPU performance per watt.
2.8 times faster, 5 times faster, 3 times faster, 11 times faster than the previous generation.
The M1 chip, at least in the CPU department, was I think about twice as fast as the Intel chip that Apple offered at the time in their MacBook Pros, and even more than that when it came to comparing it to the Air. And it was almost on par with like the highest end i9 that Apple offered in their MacBook Pro 16-inch. One of the execs even claimed that 8 gigs of RAM on an Apple Silicon machine was equal to like 16 gigs on a Windows laptop. And there's a little bit of truth to that because they use some sort of shared memory architecture, which makes them a bit more efficient, but it's still not quite, 16 gigs of RAM on a Windows equivalent. But for what it's worth, my Mac still feels far from slow even after all this time. Granted, possibly because of those higher RAM and higher storage numbers, but for any day-to-day tasks, it's just as fast as new. But even when it comes to stuff like video editing and gaming, this feels just as fast as it did 2 years ago. There hasn't really been a performance drop-off. Now, that being said, GPU-intensive tasks, such as, photo, video editing, gaming, all that stuff, rendering, they're not exactly the best on these M1 chips because the M1 lacks so much in the GPU department. Final Cut runs pretty smoothly on this laptop for most things, but when it comes to overlaying like 4 or 5 clips on top of each other, especially when you add in generators and text, that's when it starts to get choppy in playback. You have to switch the setting from better quality to better performance before it starts to play smoothly again. And the same is the case for any games that I play on this device. I do get frame drops here and there. I've just basically gotten used to it. And most of the other features of this device have held up pretty well. Great keyboard, a massive trackpad with like the haptic touch stuff, probably like my favorite part of the entire device, but it is so massive that I do get accidental touches here and there. It's also pretty light. It's only about 3 pounds for the M1 MacBook Pro. Slightly lighter, it's like 2.8 if you go for the M1 MacBook Air. But all this praise has to end somewhere, and that's when we get to the design, which is objectively the worst part of these MacBooks. When Apple first introduced them, they took the existing MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, and they just like swapped out the chip. They took out the Intel chips, and they put in an M1 chip. And for the MacBook Air, they also deleted the fans. So that means that from the outside, there is absolutely no difference between these laptops and their Intel predecessors, except for the FN key on the M1 MacBooks is slightly different. It has like a globe key right next to it. That's just an M1 thing. The M1 MacBook Pro and even the M2 MacBook Pro, so that's this device but just with an M2 chip inside, those two still have the touch bar, which I guess is a bit of a controversial topic. Apple dropped it with their Apple Silicon higher end MacBook Pros. Me personally, I actually love the touch bar. It's pretty useless. I just like having it. but from a functional standpoint, it is a lot better to have those function keys. Now, that being said, there isn't anything inherently wrong with the design of these laptops, like an unreliable keyboard. Nothing like that. It's just that it looks outdated compared to what we have now, especially with the new MacBook Pros. They have a better screen. It's like mini LED and ProMotion, so it's like faster, it's brighter, it's got better colors, and it also comes with a 1080p webcam hidden in the notch, so that's better than the dinky little 720p ones that we get in these. The Touch ID button looks better, and I think the whole just like keyboard inlet or whatever you call it, it's got like a black background on the MacBook Pros, which I think just looks better. But it doesn't end there. The M2 and M3 MacBook Airs are slightly lighter, just like by 0.1 pounds, but they're also thinner and like, I want to say a little bit bigger within the same footprint, so you feel the lightness of the device more. And as for the MacBook Pros, they get more ports. So instead of just 2 or 4 USB-C ports, you now get 3 USB-C ports, as well as a full-size HDMI, full-size SD card reader, and a MagSafe port, which is also on the new MacBook Airs, by the way. But with all that being said, why should you still stick with your M1 MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, or even go for one of these today if you can find one? The answer is most of the changes that Apple has made, at least on the lower end, so with the base model MacBooks, it's just like aesthetic. The new ones really aren't that much better under the hood. So if you're looking at, getting a new baseline like M2 MacBook Air, M3 MacBook Air, and you have one of these, unless you can really make use of, I guess, the new M2, M3 stuff, and you need that, like 20% better performance, it's not really worth it. Now, if you want the new look of the device, then yes, upgrade by all means if you want those aesthetics. But if you're looking at getting that new baseline for the performance, it's really not worth it. Now, if you're doing more intensive work, so like GPU intensive work, I guess, or more productive work, like, photo, video editing, rendering, and stuff like that, you probably have your eyes set on the Pros already. The baseline MacBooks really aren't for you. But if you use your MacBook as a glorified Chromebook, as most people do, so just, schoolwork, web browsing, Microsoft Word, Google Docs, content consumption, and stuff like that, the M1 MacBook Air and MacBook Pro will hold up fine, probably for at least another 2 to 3 years. And if you're actually looking at getting an M1 MacBook Air for just basic tasks because of the new M3 MacBook Air that just came out, they'd completely drop the prices on the older generation. And if you're looking at a new MacBook for whatever purpose, I would recommend checking out Apple's Certified Refurbished program. That's where I got my Mac. And the way it works with Apple's Certified Refurbished is it's like really rigorous. They change basically everything in your Mac, aside from like the chip. That you get a new outer shell, you get a new keyboard, you get a new battery, you get a new display, you get everything. But that's it for the video. If you've got one of these devices, let me know what it's like down in the comments below and what your use case and experience has been like with them, because I think Apple really outdid themselves with their first jump to Apple Silicon, because these things are still such great machines.